Hello, everybody. So now I want to spend some time thinking about biodiversity in space. Now, not like outer space, but like when thinking about space on Earth. So one way that we can think about diversity in space has to do with different spatial scales. Okay, so imagine you have three um, three forests. Okay, represented by these circles here. And in the bigger region, which has to do with this big white square there. Okay. Now, if you look at each individual habitat patch, you can have this thing called an alpha diversity. Alpha diversity means species richness at a local scale. Okay. So this example, this top one here has 1, 2, 3, 4 species, right? And that's that alpha diversity of right there, of 4. Now, this one then has 2, and this one has 3 different species, right? So alpha diversity, I think, is relatively easy to understand. Let's skip beta diversity for a second. Gamma diversity then has to do with the whole entire region, okay? Oops. Okay, this whole entire region. How many different species do we have in this region? Well, 1, 2, 3, 4. We haven't then counted the um, green circles, yellow circles here. That's species 3. And what's new here? That's there. Okay, we still have the triangle and the circle over here. So gamma diversity here of 6. So it's basically look at how many species you have in this entire region. Now, beta diversity, though, is kind of this tricky thing. It's the measure of difference in species composition between sites. Okay, so that's represented here, beta equal 4. Here, let me maybe erase everything on here. What's happening here is, okay, you count up the number of species basically that are different. So these are the same, right? So 1, 2, 3, 4. So this 4 is that beta here. What do we do here? We've got all different species. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So beta diversity here is 5. Here you have 2 shared species, but then the star, the yellow square, and the green square make up this beta diversity of 3. Now, beta diversity, though, is only used to compare diversity between 2 different habitats or 2 different samples. You don't want to use it. You can't just have the beta diversity of a single habitat. That doesn't make any sense. And what you can use is use these 3 different types of diversity to kind of explain things about your given community. The alpha and gamma are pretty intuitive, right? I don't have I think you should have problems with that. It's just alpha is the diversity at a given small spot. Gamma diversity is that diversity in a big spot, right? The problem, though, is where do you draw the borders? Okay, so let's go back here to this example. Let's think of this example, right? Where you have, let's say we're thinking about the gamma or the alpha diversity of this lake right here. Okay, well, it's pretty easy to think about fish species that might not obviously not be in the forest. Okay, but there might be I'm sure some hydrological connections between these systems so that should this really be one habitat? Can we talk about the alpha diversity of this, what I drew it, or because there's a little river here going between these 2 things, should really the alpha diversity be of this and this? So it's a little tricky to think about where to draw the borders of, especially the alpha diversity. But I still think it makes sense. The thing is that beta diversity, there's lots of ways to calculate it, and it's kind of hard to interpret at times. Really, for you, what you should know is that if you have high beta diversity, and that high is a relative term here, but if you have high beta diversity, you know that those habitats have very different assemblages. And just the most basic way to represent that is the number of unique species in sample one plus the number of unique species in sample two, and that is what we did over here, right? The beta diversity of 3 here was just looking at the green square 1, the star 2, and the yellow square 3, and that's how we get that 3. So now I want to talk about one of the most common ways that diversity is kind of distributed across space on our planet. And that has to do with the latitudinal species gradient. What this means is that there is basically more species at the equator. So species diversity increases from the poles to the equator. So we can see that here, latitude, right? Remember, this is either the North Pole or South Pole, and what we see is we see a big increase. Now there is, you might say, well, why doesn't the equator have, more species over here? And that really, for this example here, I believe this is like phytoplankton or something. It's because there's not as much available water at that specific area. But what we generally see is across groups, whether we're talking about plants or birds or mammals or fishes, pretty much every continent, what we see is that we always see an increase in species as you get closer to the equator. And what's interesting is we see this across time. So if what we have here is millions of years ago, 150 million years ago, I do not know why my pen thing keeps doing this. I'm sorry about that. 150 million years ago, you had still had, like, the fossils that we find had higher diversity at the equator. 45 million years ago, you still have a hump at the equator. And then this latitudinal species gradient has actually only gotten stronger with time. And it's cool that even exotic species, this happens with exotic species. I mean, it's not great that we have more exotic species at the equator, but this pattern still holds up. Probably one of the most apparent things is tree diversity. So if you go to a forest around here, North American deciduous forest, so in Wisconsin, you go out, you look at a hectare. A hectare, remember, is 100 meters by 100 meters. So, basically 2 football fields. How many species of trees are you going to find out there? You're only going to find maybe 15 to 20 here in Wisconsin. You go to a tropical rainforest, and you're going to have potentially 100 species. If you go in the middle of the Amazon rainforest in Brazil, you're going to find 100 species of trees in 1 hectare, and that's ridiculous. You go up to northern Canada then, and what you'll find is for miles and miles and miles, you only have 1 species of tree, and either spruce trees or some sort of pine tree or something. So tree diversity is extremely sensitive to this latitudinal species gradient. So we know that this latitudinal species gradient exists, but the question is, why do we have it? So your book kind of sets this up into 4 different answers, and I'll talk about null models later. Your book talks about it first, but I want to talk about these more, the ecological, historical, and evolutionary hypotheses, because they just make more intuitive sense. So when you think about these ecological hypotheses, so why do we have the latitudinal species gradient? One of the things we think it has to do with is the species energy hypothesis. Okay, so what we see is as you increase productivity in the system, and remember, productivity is just how much energy is flowing through the food web. So and we're not just talking about primary productivity here, but we're talking about productivity at each trophic level within a food web. Um, the more energy you have flowing through a system, the more individuals you can have. And that what that productivity is really determined is by the water balance. So how much water you have given the temperature. So if it's, you know, super hot but you don't have a lot of water, Nevada, that's not going to make a lot of productivity. If it's super cold but you have a bunch of water, that's still also not going to be a productive system. So the wetter and warmer a system is, generally, the more productivity you have. But that still doesn't answer a question of why does more individuals equal more species? And that's so imagine, you have a box here. I'm sorry, a and this is just numbers of individuals. I'm not sure what's going on with my writing thing right now, but okay. So if you have a whole pile of individuals, this is, a population, doesn't really matter. And you kind of carve up that population into different groups or different habitats that don't come across each other. Let's say the minimum population size is something that's this big, right? And that has to do with, genetics and inbreeding and whether the population can survive weird weird um, weather events or just demographic events of a bunch of organisms dying or something. Now, if you start out though with like a bigger box of individuals, what this means is you can divide this up into more populations. Let's say, pretend all these boxes I'm drawing are all the same size as these over here. But you can divide a population into more viable. You can divide a big population into more smaller populations that will still always be viable, which can then lead to more species in the future. Other kind of ecological hypotheses that we have for the latitudinal species gradient is that it just kind of sucks at higher latitudes, right? So here in Wisconsin, we have 6 months out of the year where it's really cold, right? Where water actually freezes, and a lot of organisms just can't deal with that. And then it's, we're not that far north, right? We're like 40 degrees north, 40. Northern Wisconsin is up at like 45, 46 degrees north latitude. So we're only about halfway. It gets a lot colder and a lot harsher as we reach the North or the South Pole. It's also more stable at the equator, right? So if you go to the lowlands of Costa Rica, so I've spent a lot of time in this part of Costa Rica where it's really low sea level, really close to the ocean. And, every day there, it's going to rain in the afternoon and it's 90 degrees all day long. It gets down to like 89 degrees at night. Okay. So it's always humid, it's always warm, and predictability is a good thing for a species because they don't have to be adapted to a bunch of different climates, basically. I should say weather patterns, not climates, right? One other thing, though, is that the tropics then are more heterogeneous, meaning, um, so this is a map here of Costa Rica showing all the different basic ecoregions. And Costa Rica is really small, right? It's much smaller than Wisconsin. And there are so many ecoregions. Just you can travel just a mile or two and get to see 3 or 4 different ecoregions depending on what part of the country you're in. And the tropics, all over the tropics, is like this, where you have so many different habitat types, meaning you can have so many different types of organisms. Each of these different ecoregions, you'll have completely different sets of organisms. So we see this over and over in the tropics that creates the more types of habitats you have, the more types of niches you will have within that habitat, which means the more type of species you can have. There's another set of hypotheses that has to do with the time and the area. Okay, and this has to do with how the continents basically have been moving through, hundreds of millions of years, basically. So go back to Pangea times, right? And what we have here is think of these two big tropical areas, South America and the middle part of Africa. Well, what if you look at this? This is the North Pole, right? This is the South Pole. Um, South America, the Amazon rainforest has basically always been at the equator and stays at the equator. The middle part of Africa, where we have this big rainforest, has stayed in pretty much along the equator for the entire time that it's been a continent. So if you've never been exposed, if the organisms there have never been exposed to the harsh climatic conditions at the poles, it makes for fewer basic extinctions. Historically, we see that there has been more area in the tropics, but that's not true with how the continents are right now. We have basically all of Russia, all of North America, and Canada. Um, not really in the poles or not really at the tropics anymore. But if you look at, most of the time, we see there was more land mass at the equator. Also, then the the tropical areas. So think about South America. It's basically never had huge glaciers. If you look at glaciation maps of North America, you see pretty much all of Canada has been wiped off the map. Like all the organisms have been bulldozed by giant glaciers and covered in miles of ice for tens of thousands of years, many different times. So it's not surprising that the forests in Canada don't have that, and Russia don't have that many species. But in the tropics, they've never really been glaciated, so they have been spared these major extinction events, and so diversity has been able to accumulate over time. So let's switch over to thinking about evolutionary hypotheses. Um, what we see is the tropics usually have higher diversification rates. Now, diversification rates is speciation, so the number of species that are arising minus the number of species that are going away. There's smaller populations. Remember how I said with that map in Costa Rica, since you have in a smaller space, you have um, a lot of individuals, but those populations themselves can be pretty small, but there's enough energy for them. Um, and so you have a lot of small populations in the tropics that are isolated from each other. What that means then is you get a lot more um, geographic isolation, a lot more genetic drift then that can happen in those geographically isolated populations. There's also some evidence to show that the interactions in um, in the tropics are stronger, okay? Because these species have had more time to basically co-evolve with each other, they can, the interactions, the predation, the competition, the mutualisms are stronger, which allows for more resource partitioning, which allows for more species to be fit in a smaller space. Then there's just less extinction, right? The environment is stable, it's mild, and you just get less extinction overall. So it kind of goes back feeding into this higher diversification rates. Right, now I want to switch to this null hypothesis for the latitudinal species gradient. As a null models can explain patterns without mechanisms. Okay, so the they're just basically based on randomization, and we can use these things, the predictions that may come from these null models, to test reality against. So there's this thing called the mid-domain effect as one of the reasons why we tend to see the latitudinal species gradient. Now it's kind of a tricky thing to think about, but the way it's explained is, imagine if you had a bunch of species that ranges that are explained as the length of these pencils. Okay, so and then you have the world as this pencil box. Okay, and you have a gradient then from South Pole to equator to North Pole. Now, if you shake up and randomize where these pencils fall, and even if you have random species ranges for how long these pencils are, what you're gonna, because you have some long pencils and you have some short pencils, what you're gonna have is somewhere in the middle, you're gonna have them overlapping more often. So, imagine if you had a bunch of relatively long pencils in here and you shook them up. Well, as long as you shook them up and randomized them okay, you will have most of the species if overlapping somewhere in the middle, especially if these pencils are very long. Because the only way they're if they're all relatively long, the only way they're not going to be touching each other is at the edges of the box, which is in this case the poles. So this is an example of if you were to take all the species on the planet, mix them up, and just throw them down on the planet, given their range size, you would expect more of them to be just along the equator just because of their range sizes or their range tolerances to be able to be viable at the equator. So you just have more species just in the middle for really no reason at all. But these null models that we oftentimes use compare to see if we have the mid-domain effect or see if we have null models or see how our reality, how the actual species diversity or whatever you're looking at compares to that null model, and that allows us to get some insight into without having to think of all of these evolutionary hypotheses, historical hypotheses, ecological hypotheses, right? Well, that all might be true, but if the mid-domain effect is true, it kind of overrides everything else. So we have to see where there are exceptions, and then we can really learn about the biology that way, rather than just seeing maybe a pattern that is kind of created randomly. So you might ask the question, well, which one of these hypotheses is true? And realistically, you can find you can find evidence for the mid-domain effect. You can find evidence for evolutionary hypotheses, for ecological, for historical hypotheses. So it's not just any one thing here. It's just kind of probably a bunch of different reasons have created more diversity at the tropics. And it's a really cool place. I really suggest all of you trying to get to a tropical rainforest at some time, because the amount of diversity that you find in these rainforests is just crazy and really cool to see. So let's switch gears a little bit and think about small scale diversity patterns. So we're no longer talking about planet-wide scales. We're talking about things that are a lot smaller. So what we see is this relationship between productivity and diversity. And one of the most common things that we see are this hump-shaped curve based on, from low productivity up to really high productivity. So when we're thinking about the ascending portion of this curve, which is right here, right? As you get more energy, you can have more species. So more energy flowing through the food web, you can have more species with those minimum viable population sizes, right? So if you only have a very small amount of energy going through the system, so let's say right there, right? You're really only going to be able to house a couple species here. Low, not very many species. But as you get more productivity, you can house more species within your within that habitat. Now, the descending curve, so portion of the curve, that's really talking about over here, we think has something to do with light limitation. So, as you throw a ton of nutrients at a specific area to increase the productivity, we oftentimes see that there's a lot of competition for those nutrients. And so if for trees or for algae in a lake, the best competitors will shade everything else out, and we lose a lot of that species diversity. So we see that this going down here. Interestingly, though, we might actually think that or that there's a null explanation here that makes a lot of sense once you start to think about it. So why do we see so the null model is kind of asking the question, why do we see this hump-shaped curve? Why do we see high diversity at these middle productivity values? And what we see is just across the planet, really, really high productivity. So really, really high productivity habitats and really, really low productivity habitats are relatively rare. There's not that many places that have these super high productivity and super low productivity. So, okay, so we know that to be true. But so what that means then is most of the habitats around the planet are at this medium productivity. Okay, and that medium productivity then is super common, so we have more species there. So if you have more species that are evolved to a medium productivity system, that means that the global species pool is larger for medium productivity systems to draw from. Now, what does that mean? So one of the ways you can think about how species get to an area is there's, let's say we open up a piece of land in Wisconsin, right, where we plow over, cut down a forest, plow it over, and just let it grow then and this is a big area that's like, lots of square miles. Now, there's a lot of species across the planet that if you threw tree seeds on there, they would grow. But for a lot of reasons, we don't see those species getting there. But it is possible that a maple tree from over in Russia could blow over here and fall down in this like plowed field that we're talking about, and then you could get mm, lots of different species from lots of different areas. But what we see is if there are more species to draw from, you will end up with more species in that habitat to end up with. And that's what this null explanation for. If you have more um, more medium productivity habitats, there'll be more species like across the planet that are evolved to live there, so that and new habitat that comes up, they'll have more total candidates of species that might get there at some point, and then create this higher productivity in these middle habitats or middle productivity habitats. There's also some really interesting relationships that we see of diversity with like how local and regional diversity is correlated. And what we see is that alpha diversity is relatively correlated with gamma diversity. The more species you have in the region, the more species you'll have at a small space in that region, and vice versa, right? So the more species you have in a really small space, that means you're probably going to have more species total. Um, but what's interesting is that alpha diversity oftentimes plateaus with increased gamma. So if we have here, oops, can't probably see that very well. Okay, so if we have gamma diversity increasing, what we oftentimes see is that it kind of, um, not sure why that did that, but just erase. Ooh, that doesn't work. I'm sorry. Um, so you get some sort of plateau. Now, what's happening here is that when you get a lot of species in one area, you can have really this interactions, the predation, competition, really limiting the number of species that can live in some place because they limit the number of niches. So oftentimes what we see is that alpha diversity will plateau, um, and so even though a region might have a whole lot of species, that doesn't mean that all of those species in that region will be able to be found in one small area due to things like competition not letting a new species in or something like that. So when we think about all of the things we've talked about in this unit, it has a lot of really interesting conservation implications. So the UW Nature Preserve, right? So it's just north of the football field. We've got these trails going through, and it's really, it's not that big. It's like maybe 2 square miles or something, right? So we have a little forested area over here, and there is a little, I think this goes to about over here. There is a prairie area, a maintained prairie area over there. But so how many mammal species can we have in the UW Nature Preserve? And my wife has done some work, some camera trapping in there, and what we see is you see a lot of deer, you see raccoons, skunks, foxes, a lot of squirrels. There's actually badgers in the nature reserve. I was very surprised to see that. That was pretty cool. There's a bunch of mice and smaller rodents and like chipmunks and stuff like that. But you know, when we think about the given size of, or let's think about our, maybe the goal of someone could be, I really want to increase the mammal species that we have in at UWW Nature Preserve. Okay, that's a noble goal, but that might not actually be possible because how many species can we have here given where we are at our latitude, given how that really, really strong ecological law of, this place isn't very big, right? This forest is just a couple, maybe 1.5 square miles. So it's not really that going to be able to hold that many species. And I think a lot of effort is wasted, I should say, when they try to increase the numbers of species without considering these things like that species area relationship, how productive the system is, what regional species, how many regional species there is, right? Like, so maybe, this list of species here that are found relatively commonly in this nature reserve, that might be relatively close to what is at the regional species pool. There's not that many mammal species here in Wisconsin that you wouldn't necessarily find. I mean, there's there's plenty, right, that we don't find here, but it's actually approaching that regional species pool relatively well. So that effort to increase the habitat or make the uh, mammal, to try to get more species in here, might not actually be doable. So with that, I'll leave it at that and see y'all later.